To be with you today. Currently, I'm filming in Texas, but I'm wishing that I can be in beautiful Argentina with all of you. In 2007, I lived in South America, and I served as a missionary with the International Mission Board, and I absolutely loved my time there. And I hope that one day I can come back and visit. Word of Life is very near and dear to my heart. My husband, Eric Garland, grew up in Word of Life. He went to the Bible Institute in New York, and he was saved at the age of 5 and surrendered his life to ministry at the age of 16, both at a Word of Life camp. So to be able to speak with you today at a Word of Life conference means more to me than you will ever know. Thank you so much for this opportunity. Before I begin, I want to tell you a little bit about who I am. My name is Krissie Garland, and I'm a Christ follower. I was saved at the age of 6, and I surrendered my life to the ministry at the age of 16. I am also a mom. I have 2 amazing and crazy 2-year-old twins. They are the light of my life. Their names are Joa Shepherd and Selah Grace, and they keep me very, very busy. I am also a licensed professional counselor. I work at a Christian counseling center for a local church, and I get to partner with other churches in our area to work with our community and with people who are struggling with depression, anxiety, grief, trauma, addiction, suicidal ideation, and other issues like that. And I love the ministry that God allows me to do. I mentioned my husband Eric a little bit earlier. We met at seminary in 2009 when he moved from New York to Texas. We were both studying to go into the ministry, and I fell for him pretty quickly. Eric had a unique way of connecting with people. Everywhere we went, he would always make every person in the room feel loved and feel special. He loved to share about Jesus with others, and I fell in love with him. We were married in 2011, and we had big dreams to serve our God together. And we went into local church ministry, and that was our life for many, many years. But there's a deeper story to our life and to our ministry that I'm going to share with you today. And I pray that it will help strengthen your ministry. I pray it will enlighten your thoughts on cultivating an awareness to the growing problems that believers face today. What I didn't say earlier is that I'm also a widow. And this is the first time that I am saying this out loud publicly. I'm a widow, and it hurts every time I say it. My husband, he died in January, only 4 months ago. He was 31 years old when he chose to take his own life. See, Eric struggled with depression that he constantly fought, depression that he often ignored and pushed aside, depression that he was often shamed for, and depression that ultimately took his life. And I still try to wrap my head around how someone with so much joy, so much talent and conviction could also carry so much pain. Because in our minds, pastors didn't struggle with these things, but they do. And Eric was a pastor for 7 years in local church ministry. He absolutely loved it, and he was wonderful at it. It was his calling in life. But as many of you have experienced, ministry can be extremely lonely and stressful at times. And Eric never wanted to disappoint anyone. He felt like to be a good pastor, he had to be close to perfect. And he put these expectations on himself, but they were also expectations placed on him from other believers and leaders. And through the years, he began to feel the stress of ministry. And he began to get sick. My husband had shingles 4 times throughout his ministry. But in 2017, he was diagnosed with kidney cancer. And this was absolutely devastating because he was only 30 years old. But what was even more devastating was the fact that we found out he had cancer, and in the same week, we found out that he had a terrible addiction to opioids. And if you don't know what that is, it's pain medication. So within a year's time, my husband had this cancer growing inside of him, but he also had this terrible disease of addiction. We were scared, and we were heartbroken. And he went in front of our church, and he confessed his sin. He told them about his addiction and about his struggles. And the very next day, he went to rehab in another city. And he fought to overcome his addiction. And in August of 2017, he became clean, and he stayed clean until his very last breath. And we praise God every single day for that. And he began to want to share how God had healed him of cancer, because God did heal him of cancer. But thankfully, there was a church in Tyler, Texas that embraced us and loved us in our heartbreak. And Eric began to write and share his testimony more. He began to write a curriculum to help churches understand mental illness and addiction. He wanted to bring awareness to the rising epidemic amongst believers and church leaders. He was a fallen pastor. He loved the Lord so much. But when he was open about his past, he was often shunned. And he didn't want anyone else, especially another minister, to experience what he had experienced. And he wanted to share this message of love and hope. But on a very dark day in January, at the deepest point of his depression, he made a choice, a wrong choice, to take his life. So I'm here today sharing this message with you. I want to help educate and enlighten you to these growing problems. I want to help change the stigma that pastors have to have it all together and they have to strive for perfection. The stigma that mistakes are your identity. The idea that addiction is just too shameful to talk about. And the stigma that mental health is something we don't discuss. When Eric was in rehab, he was there with 6 other evangelical pastors who struggled with addiction. But these pastors also struggled with coexisting disorders of depression and anxiety. Pastors are not immune to pain and struggle. We must allow our pastors, we must allow you as our church leaders to be real so that you can get the help and accountability that you need, but also so that you can create a culture of compassion for those you serve. And I believe with all my heart that you can create this culture in your churches. A culture where people can be real. A culture that points people to the gospel and to the saving grace of Jesus Christ, but also to the sustaining grace that gives us freedom and forgiveness in our everyday mistakes, sins, and mishaps. After my husband died, I chose to share his story publicly. And I wrote in his story this: my husband's true story needs to be told. It needs to be a megaphone to those who are struggling, to those who don't understand, and to those who have the power to make a difference. And I stand in front of you today, humbly asking you to make a difference and telling you that you do have the power to make a difference, not only in your churches and your communities and your cities, but also in your own life. So how do we take this beyond this room and beyond these doors and into our churches and our community. I'm going to give you 3 things today. And I have so many ideas, but I feel like these 3 things will help you apply it in your own life as well as in your communities. The first thing is educate yourself. Be aware of the struggles around you. Of course, today I'm going to focus on depression and mental illness and addiction because it is so close to my heart, but also because it is such a rising problem in our world today. And I believe that the church should be on the front lines, ready to talk about these things. 1 in 5 people struggle with chronic depression. That's depression that people experience throughout their whole life. And 1 in 25 people struggle with addiction. My husband wrote in one of his journals, if mental illness and addiction are understood as a disease, necessary steps can be put in place to keep this disease from destroying someone's life. And when I was first married to Eric, I remember him saying, if I only had longer quiet times, if I only read the Bible more, if I only prayed more, then I wouldn't experience this inner turmoil, this inner sadness. And though these things are foundations of our everyday Christian life, and they are so important, God provides other resources as well. And eventually my husband did get into Christian counseling, and he did start medication, and that did help him. But the church tends to view mental illness as a character flaw rather than a medical condition. We often pray for physical healing for people, but then we often ignore mental healing. If you view these things not as something to fix in someone, but something to walk through and to help with, people will be more likely to share and be open about it. Of course, as a Christian counselor, I am a big advocate of churches partnering with mental health professionals. And I know not everyone has this resource available, but I encourage you when you do go back, look around your city and see if there is a Christian practice that you can partner with. And if there isn't anything that you find, I encourage you to consider starting a Christian counseling ministry within your church. We need to show these people that we care, and often, especially unchurched people, will not come to a pastor to talk about these things, but they may go to a professional. Educate yourself. Second, change starts with you. Change happens one person at a time, and it needs to begin with you. I want to encourage you today to be open and honest about what you are personally struggling with. Pastors seem to have a deep purpose to pointing others to the gospel and to Jesus. And in that position, you become a public figure of strength and of purpose. But in this position, you also take on all the pressures along with it. Often, pastors don't feel safe to share their struggles. And we need to change that. You need to change that. I know it is difficult to reach out for help and to admit what you're going through, but I think it is so important that you do so. I saw it in my husband's life. He didn't want to reach out. He didn't want to know people. He didn't want to know that he struggled. He didn't want others to know that he struggled. And I'm here to be very clear about something and to share with you that we do not have it together. We are not God. We are human. And God equips us to do some pretty incredible things, like the Isaiah passage says. But we are all broken. And it's okay. It is what we do with our brokenness that matters. Do we hide in fear that someone's going to find out? in shame? Or do we live in the freedom that the gospel gives us? The freedom to talk about it, the freedom to admit it, the freedom to seek help for it. I saw a statistic the other day that 70% of pastors struggle with depression. And maybe that's not your struggle, but whatever your struggle is, I want you to know today that you are not alone. Change begins with you. The last point is very simple. Follow Jesus' example. Jesus was the model of compassion. Tax collectors, prostitutes, the lame, the blind, the broken, they all came to Jesus because they knew that they would be met with healing and not judgment. They knew that he would show them love and kindness. We need to model our compassion after what Jesus displayed. And compassion is more than just speaking about it or observing it from the sidelines. It is the willingness to step down and to walk along someone in their suffering. It means that our hearts break when their hearts break. It includes acts of kindness to help alleviate their suffering. It means listening to them and showing them love. It means reaching out to them, noticing them, recognizing them. Jesus died for all people. Compassion. Follow Jesus' example. I grew up a pastor's kid, and when I was a little girl, I remember kicking off my shoes and twirling around the worship center. And I would sit on the second row right next to my mom. And I would watch and listen to my dad preach, and I would be in awe as he talked about this good, loving, and just God. See, church was my home. Church was my safe place. And as I got older and I became a teenager, I started to learn the ins and outs of church, the behind-the-scenes things. But I loved the church so much, and that's when I was called into full-time ministry, and I knew that the church would be one of my mission fields. And then in seminary, I was a youth minister to teenage girls, and I remember bringing them all to the first few rows because I wanted them to love church. I wanted them to know they belonged in church. I wanted them to know that Jesus loved them. And I wanted them to have a sense of knowing that the church would be there for them. And as a pastor's wife, we would always sit on the first few rows. My husband was a family pastor, but oftentimes he would preach. And you better believe I was on one of those first few rows as I listened to him share the Word of God. But when my husband stood in front of our church and he confessed his sin, and he talked about his addiction and about his struggles, something changed. I no longer felt safe in the place that I loved so dearly. I feared the church. The first 2 weeks when my husband was in rehab, I got myself up because I wanted my children to go to church. I wanted them to love church. And even though it was so hard for me to walk through those front doors, I did. And we went to that church, and I sunk in the back row as if I were a leper that no one wanted to talk to and no one wanted to touch. Church had become a place I dreaded because now I felt like I had shame written across my chest. It was a very difficult time in our life. But the toughest part wasn't taking my husband to rehab. It wasn't taking him to his counseling sessions or the daily fight to make sure that he stayed clean. It wasn't getting him up in the mornings because he was too depressed to get out of bed. The toughest part was walking through the front doors of the church that I once loved so dearly. However, after a couple of Sundays, I remembered something. When I felt hopeless and I felt like everything had been stripped from me, I knew at the core of who I was that the church was where I belonged. The church is for the broken. It is for those who have sin, who have struggle. It is not for those who think they are good and they think they don't have sin and they think they don't have struggles. The church is for the broken. So I end with this. God has brought you to this place for a reason. My prayer is that you take this message, think on it, and go back home and do something about it. Be Jesus to the hurting. And if it's you that's hurting, if it's you that's struggling, if you're tired, if you're feeling alone, know that you're not. Reach out to someone you trust and seek help. It is not too shameful to do so. The gospel tells us that when we were at our worst, God sent his son Jesus to die on the cross, and he had you in mind. He saw our sin. He saw our pain. He saw our addiction, our depression. And he saw us in our struggle. He saw us at our worst, and he met us there. And he loved us there, and he accepted us there. And he drew us in to him. God desires to pick up all of our broken pieces, put them beautifully back together again, and use us for his work. He is the great Redeemer and the great Restorer. Simply put, he loves you and he loves me. We only need to choose to believe it and to show it to a lost and hurting world.